Well, I hate to share bad news, but it's almost the start of a new school year. And you know what that means? You're probably going to end up emailing a professor or two. Luckily, in today's video, we'll set you up to do just that. Because I study rhetoric and writing, I have a lot of people ask me to help them write things like college application essays, emails, and sometimes even text messages. And now that's not because I have a lot of experience applying to college or because I'm some kind of world-class text messenger, but I think it is because I've put a lot of time into learning and developing rhetorical skills. So that means that I know how to figure out how to write something even if I've never written anything like it before. Now, I have also spent a lot of time teaching first-year college writing classes, which means that I've gotten a bunch of emails that range from the very formal ones addressed to Dear Professor to the kind of sloppy ones with no subject line and the text that only says, "Why did I get a C- on my paper?" And in case you were wondering, the answer to that last one was because I was feeling really generous. But the point is that especially for new college students, getting the rhetorical balance right when you're emailing a professor can be kind of tricky. When you're trying to work out a misunderstanding with the person who controls your grade, the stakes can feel a lot higher than they actually are. But luckily, there are some rhetorical skills and understanding that you can use to write more effective emails. And frankly, getting a good handle on the rhetorical situation early on can be kind of fun. Figuring out who you're addressing, how you want to come across, and what you need to say in order to accomplish your goals can feel a lot like detective work, and it will make your chances of a positive outcome much better. Actually, speaking of detective work, that reminds me that I know a guy who would probably be better at explaining this stuff than I would be. So why don't you sit back and enjoy a brief journey through time and space on your way to learning how to write better emails to your professors. So you want to write emails to professors, do you? Well, I gotta admit, you came to the right guy. You see, I'm an RSI, or a Rhetorical Situation Investigator. I used to work for the force, but they disbanded my unit, and I've been doing private work ever since. So yeah, I can give you some pointers, but it's gonna cost you. No, I don't want your money. This is a reputation business. A good old-fashioned like is all I'll need. Now, with that matter of payment out of the way, let's start talking basics. Actually, your case reminds me of one that I took a while back. I was sitting in my office one night, like I usually do, watching the rain run down the windows and thinking about simpler times when this cat walks in stinking like a college campus. I knew what he wanted before he even sat down, but I let him talk anyway. He said he was running out of time. He had a paper due, but he wasn't quite done with it, and he wanted to ask for an extension. But his professor was a great big question mark. I suppose you could say she frightened him the way the emptiness of outer space frightens me. And I felt for him. You see, work was slow back in those days, so I told him I'd take the case, and then I explained I was going to need time to figure out who his professor was, who he wanted to come across as, and what he needed to say to get that extension. I also told him it wasn't going to be as scary as he thought. It was the unknown that frightened him, not his professor. With that, he left my office, and I hit the streets. I knew I needed some information, and I also knew that Sable's Lounge was the place to get it. A good RSI knows that you always start with the audience. Unless you know who you're writing to, you're bound to mess up something important. So, like I mentioned, I made a beeline for Sable's Lounge. Sable knew everyone. She had eyes and ears all over the city, and I knew she'd know something about my suspect. And of course, she did. She had a stack of old university records in the back room, told me I could take a look at them as long as I kept quiet about it. Honestly, I don't know who she thought I'd tell. But anyway, I found the info I was looking for. The kid's professor was Janine Doherty, assistant professor in the history department. The first thing I wanted to know was how we were going to address her. You see, people can be kind of funny about titles, especially when they've sold a half-decade of their lives or more to get them. Plus, the way you address a professor sets the tone for the rest of the email. The good ones will tell you how to address them, but for all of the rest, you'll have to do some digging. If you've ever gotten an email from one of them, it's a pretty safe bet to go with however they signed the email. If they sign as Dr. Plum, then that's how you should address them. Of course, if they do that crazy thing academics do and just sign with their initials, well, you're going to have to do a little more work. So check your syllabus, look up their department bio, but also remember that your safest bet is to call them professor and their last name. You know, in general, it's probably better to have a professor ask you to call them by their first name than to ask you to call them by their title. So if you have to make a choice, it's better to be too formal than too casual. Plus, if your teacher's a graduate student getting every last ounce of cheap labor squeezed out of them, calling them professor might just give them the boost they need to stay in school. Getting the way you address your professor right might seem like kind of a shallow thing, and maybe it is, but it also serves a greater purpose. Not only does it set the tone for the email, but it shows that you understand the situation, understand your audience, and see where they're coming from. And you really are going to want to make sure that you understand where your professor is coming from. One way to do that is to make sure that the answer to your question hasn't already been given somewhere else. So double check your syllabus. Go through the messages that your professor's already sent you. You know, writing an email to a student that starts with, "as it says in the syllabus," is kind of a drag. And keep in mind that your professors are people. They want to be addressed with respect like anyone does, but they probably don't want you to go overboard. And yeah, they've got rules and policies, but they're not out to get you. So treat them like people doing a job, and not like arch villains trying to destroy your life, or like some kind of supreme being who wants you to grovel. Either of those options is probably going to make them feel uncomfortable and make them a little more resistant to whatever you have to say. But that's enough of that. You're also going to want to figure out how you want to present yourself. And of course that depends on the situation, but maybe not as much as you might think. So to get a fix on my client, I tailed the kid for a few weeks from a discreet distance. I hid behind newspapers, wore dark glasses, you know the routine. I wanted to see what he was really like, figure out what kind of self he should put forward in his email. Of course, if you get a good handle on your audience, it's a lot easier to get your own stance right. It's probably not too surprising that you want to present yourself as both confident and competent. You want to be polite, but you also don't want to exaggerate it. And probably most importantly, you want to come across as a human writing an email to another human. So start by saying something pleasant, something, I don't know, like, "I hope you're having a good afternoon," or "Thanks for the great lecture the other day." None of this will get your question answered, but it will build goodwill. It shows your professor that you see them as a real human being, and it makes it more likely that they'll respond to you as one too. For professors who teach a lot of large classes, it would probably be a good idea to identify yourself clearly early on. You could tell them, for example, which class you're in. That would give them a better chance to remember who you are. And if you're in a smaller class, that might not be as necessary, but it sure wouldn't hurt. Now, when it comes to actually making your request, be thoughtful about it. How would you like it if someone were making a request to you? Would you like it if they made terse demands? What if they were apologizing every other word for inconveniencing you? Both of those are pretty bad options, so be straightforward, but not demanding. When my client finally came back to my office, I was ready to fill him in on everything I'd learned during the investigation and to help him figure out how he was actually going to address Dr. Doherty. See, once he knew who his audience was, had a good handle on the version of himself that he wanted to present, and understood the relationship that he was trying to establish, it was going to be a whole lot easier for him to know what to say and how to say it. So we reviewed the facts of the case. His professor was Janine Doherty. He was going to be straightforward but polite in order to establish a professional but friendly relationship through the email. He was going to ask for an extension, and the syllabus didn't say anything about extensions, so there was actually a point in emailing her. And it turned out not to be so hard. He introduced himself, briefly explained that he was behind on his assignment because of a fire in his building, and asked if he could turn in his paper a day late. Admittedly, it was a pretty dramatic reason for needing an extension, but it was also an undisputably valid one. But for those of you trying to recreate my client's success, what you say really isn't much of a mystery. If you're going to make some kind of request, you should include it in your email. But beyond that obvious point, there are other kinds of information that you should consider including depending on what you have to say. If you're writing to set an appointment, be sure to include the times that you're available. Your professor's going to need to know that, and it saves them from having to ask. If you're going to be absent, be sure to tell your professor why, but spare them the gritty details. You should tell them that you're going to the doctor, but don't feel like you need to tell them what for. If you need extra time on an assignment, be sure to tell them how much time you need. That way, they don't have to make up an arbitrary length for an extension. Oh, and whatever your reason is for writing, be sure to make it clear in the subject line. There's really nothing more suspicious than a blank subject line. But you and I both know that figuring out what to say isn't really the issue. Knowing how to say it is the real trick. But knowing your audience and the relationship you're trying to establish with them will go a long way towards helping you figure that out. So let's say you're unsure about why you got a certain grade. Don't just email your professor and say, "Why did I get a C- on my paper?" Because that gets the relationship wrong. First of all, it's just way too aggressive. But it also indicates that you haven't spent any time looking at their feedback And it implies that you, somebody who has spent a few weeks studying for a class, knows better than a professor who has spent years studying, teaching, and grading assignments on the topic. So instead, you could write, "Thanks for your feedback on my paper. After reviewing your notes, I had a few questions about what I could do to improve for the next assignment." Even if you hate your teacher's guts, this kind of an email establishes a different and better kind of relationship, and it will make your professor more receptive to your request because they aren't feeling attacked. Similarly, instead of saying, "You didn't set up the assignment right, now there's not a button to submit my paper," consider saying something like, "I went to submit my assignment and couldn't find the submission button. Am I missing something?" You know full well that your teacher goofed, but you don't need to call them out on it. Be gracious to them, and they'll be gracious to you. Oh, and don't ever write, "I missed class on Monday. Did we do anything important?" Because as much as you might feel like school is sometimes a waste of time, your professor is never intentionally going to fill a day with unimportant things. So maybe instead of offending them, you could say, "I was sick on Monday and couldn't come to class, but I've checked the syllabus and I've done the reading. Could I maybe come to your office hours on Thursday to get caught up on the things that I missed?" And one of the best ways to sign off is by simply saying thanks or some variation of it and including your name. It's polite, it's efficient, and it ends on the right note. Plus, the world really would just be a better place if everyone everywhere quit signing off with just the word best. But listen, what do I know? I'm just a simple hard-boiled RSI with a pint of chocolate milk and a slice of pie waiting for me at Louie's Diner. So if you do have any questions, why don't you save them for the guy who sent you here? Oh hey, welcome back. How was your trip? Hopefully you found what you were looking for. RSIs are a rare breed, but they sure can come in handy. Either way, when you are emailing a professor, just make sure to establish a friendly and respectful relationship. They're really not that hard to talk to, especially if you follow these tips. Plus, if you're looking for a quick reference to use the next time you are emailing a professor, check out the guide on the website. There's a link in the description. And as long as you're headed in that direction, feel free to leave your comments and questions below. Also, if there's any kind of document you'd like the RSA to investigate next, let me know in the comments as well, and I'll pass it along. That's the nice thing about private RSIs. They're always taking requests. Frankly, I sort of feel like I'm getting away with something, only being in this video at the beginning and end, but I guess I shouldn't complain either. It is nice to get a break every once in a while. So let's call it good for today and both take a break. And by take a break, I mean you go write powerful emails and I'll get started on next week's video. I'm excited to see you there.